Hi, everybody. Welcome back. So today, like I promised, we're going to be taking a look at a lot of Roman architecture and continuing on to discuss the emperors. I think there's going to be some really cool things that you guys are going to enjoy today in terms of how to show off the city of Rome. I have a special plan for that. But first, we're going to talk about the emperors. Who were these guys? And what did they achieve? And why did they want to make the city of Rome look so spectacular? Because that's kind of what the legacy they left us with in a lot of ways was a lot of really spectacular buildings and monuments, and of course the idea of the emperor as ruler of this empire. So let's switch back to our PowerPoint with Augustus here. Okay, so we remember who was the winner of the Second Civil War? That was Augustus Caesar, originally known as Octavian, but historians, once he becomes emperor, they like to call him Augustus, the most revered one. He has control of the Senate. They do what he tells them to do. In fact, legally, he has a very special position, which is the first citizen, the princeps, but also the imperator, the commander of all the armies. And he is really the first emperor. Julius Caesar tried to be emperor, didn't last long enough to really make it happen. Augustus is, according to most historians, the first emperor. And he presented himself, we talked about his propaganda machine that really took down Cleopatra and made her into a wicked witch type of figure, or, Eastern decadence type of figure. He had a pretty good propaganda machine for propping himself up too, which should be no surprise. He promoted the idea of the golden age. He was, the leader of all of Rome, and he had brought Rome peace by winning the war. But it's true that after he took over, there was no more civil wars, there was no more fighting, and basically this whole giant Roman Empire was pretty much at peace within its own borders. And this is something that a lot of people appreciate about the Roman Empire, is they call it the Pax Romana. The Pax Romana meaning the peace of Rome. And the peace made by Rome is that basically anywhere in this gigantic empire, there was peace between all the different parts. So people could travel between the different parts of the empire, and they could trade with other parts of the empire. And, a lot of people stayed in their local communities and just paid money to the people in Rome every so often. But, it seems to have been a time of prosperity precisely because people didn't have to fear that, if you're in Greece, you don't have to fear that these guys over here are going to come invade you. And if you're in Egypt, you don't have to fear that the Seleucids are going to come invade you, because the Seleucids got taken over by Rome. So basically, within these borders, things are at peace. And this state of things lasts for a good long time, for most of the duration of the empire as a proper thing. So a good few hundred years there. We might compare it to what's going on in China, Han China, which is doing much the same thing and lasting for roughly the same time period. So in some ways, Augustus is right. He is a bringer of peace because he's, the victor of the Civil War, so he can do that. And of course, he wants to promote himself that way. Look at him here in this statue. He's wearing a crown of victory, but also sort of associated flowers associated with peace. So he's really milking that image up. And let's take a look at him in some other images too. Here's some more of his statues that he made for himself. This one shows him as a religious figure. When you pull your toga up over your head, like he's doing here, that means that you're sacrificing to the gods. So he's showing that he's very pious. He's giving the proper respect to the gods. So he's got it figured out. This one shows him as a warrior. So he's a victorious general. He's also showing himself as very strong and very capable of leading Rome's armies, which it seems like he was pretty good at. He kept the borders basically the same throughout his reign. And if we were to look closely at his breastplate, it's kind of hard to see here, but it has a lot of scenes from Roman mythology, famous battles that the Romans were involved in. And I think there's even a reference to Romulus and Remus being raised by a wolf. I think down here might be where that's happening. So he's got a lot going on, and he's showing exactly who he is as a leader, a religious leader, a political leader, military leader, all these kinds of leaders. And he is the one to make Rome, this perfect society, or at least that's what he would have you think, because he had a very important job, which is to get the Roman people on his side, make them like him. Now, he said that emperors and these big generals were often very popular with the common people because they would, give them more money, give them more food. Yeah, he seems to have been doing that same sort of thing. So he had the mechanism figured out pretty well. Now, we should mention the context of religion. You might have heard that people worshipped the Roman emperors. They did. That's true. That we just need to be very specific about how they did that. So during Augustus's lifetime, he was not worshipped, but he did have everybody worship the dead Julius Caesar. He said, "My uncle slash father, he was a god." And after he's dead, we know that he has gone to rejoin the gods and he is one of the gods. So everybody worship him. And then when Augustus died, his successor said, okay, everybody worship Augustus. And so the emperors never claimed to be gods in their own lifetime, but it might be a little implied there because basically every other emperor has had his previous, has had the previous emperor treated as a god. And so this is the imperial cult, worshiping all the emperors who have come before. And temples are set up with statues of the previous emperors throughout the city of Rome. So it becomes a pretty important thing in terms of how the Romans think of themselves, this idea of worshiping the emperors. And the emperors, when they die, they become gods. Of course, the emperor was said to be descended from the gods. Julius Caesar was said to be descended from the gods. If we look more closely at this little statue here, we have a little tiny winged baby holding on to Augustus's clothes here. And this is a version of the god Cupid, known as Eros to the Greeks, the god of love, who is a child of Venus, also known as Aphrodite. Julius Caesar's family always said that they were descended from Aphrodite. So that was part of their justification for being gods. And here is Augustus showing himself hanging out with his cousin, basically, or, distant uncle. That would be, Cupid over here. So it's very clever. Okay, so getting into Roman architecture a bit, we'll look at some of Augustus's achievements and we'll move into more Roman emperors in a second here. But we should note that Rome had some architectural innovations. One of them was the arch. Now, the Greeks had played around a little bit with arches, but not in a big way like the Romans did. And the arch is an incredibly useful thing architecturally because you can make things that are really big and really strong if you use arches. The way the weight is held together by the shape of the arch keeps everything together. Quite frequently, Romans would use them to make aqueducts. So this is actually an aqueduct. It's a channel where water would flow downhill and people could get fresh water from all the way in the mountains. So there was a great amount of engineering that the Romans did, and even the Roman army had a pretty good amount of engineering within it to be able to build bridges and things like that. And aqueducts are a great example of Roman engineering and how Rome used like greater organization maybe than any empire that had come before it, because it could pump all this water in to have water for this huge city, and many aqueducts flowed into the city. But getting back to Augustus a bit, we're talking about his Golden Age idea. One of the ways that he promoted this Golden Age idea was with the Altar of Peace. So this is an altar set up in the city of Rome, a big old square where you could make a sacrifice to the goddess of peace, for one thing. And it is a pitch perfect example of Augustus's kind of propaganda. Let's look at some of these figures on here. So over on the right here, and these are different panels from the sides of the altar. We have all these plants growing, these different plant patterns. And here we've got a goddess of some sort with little babies on her lap and other goddesses supporting her, birds flying by, animals at her feet, again, plants growing. We are pretty sure this is the goddess of peace. So peace has come to Rome, and look, everybody's having children. There's lots of animals all over the place. Everybody's happy. This is sort of the idealized life in the countryside that some rich Romans really like, even though they don't want to actually live in the countryside. So they have this idea of peace and prosperity, which is shown by the altar here. And then over here we have the Roman senators. So here is a whole bunch of senators, and Augustus is saying, hey, look, the senators, they're all on my side. They are helping support this peace and make this work. And furthermore, Augustus also puts his own family on the altar. And this is a wonderful image because you can see the individuality of these different faces. You have basically all of Augustus's family, who are known as the Julio-Claudians. Basically, all their children, they're kind of a fusion of two families whose children are frequently named Julius or Claudius or something like that. And the Julio-Claudians are the family of Augustus. And here they are, lots of different men and women of that family, because Augustus is looking to the future. He wants there to be future emperors after he's gone. So people think, okay, what's going to happen when Augustus dies? Is there going to be another emperor? Augustus wants the message to very clearly be yes. So he's saying, look, I've got the whole family here, and this family is going to become a dynasty. We've got this on lock. So he's showing the older members of the generation, but he's also showing the children. And the children, some of these children are actually going to be future emperors. And that is kind of what I think Augustus wanted people to think. So everything is secure, everything is taken care of. He's got a whole plan. He's got his heirs to the throne all figured out. So that's basically Augustus's propaganda machine here, and how he has that all worked out. And people would see this monument in Rome, and they would go to worship the goddess of peace at it. And at the same time, they would see Augustus showing that his family was bringing peace for all the foreseeable future. Okay, I just want to look at a few different emperors here. There's good emperors and there's bad emperors. And historians debate as to which is which. Obviously, there's a lot of propaganda flying around. Some guy gets defeated and taken over by another emperor, the new emperor might say the old one was bad. So we have to be careful about, there is some broad consensus on who some of the bad ones were, and also who some of the good ones were. I think one of the best from Augustus's family is generally considered to be Claudius. Claudius didn't really want to be emperor, and he was sort of the last pick for the job. He had some kind of stutter, maybe some kind of handicap as well. He mostly just wanted to read Etruscan literature and be a scholarly type person, but his family picked him to be emperor even though he didn't want to. And he did a pretty good job, which people have taken as evidence that if you want to have a good leader, make it someone who isn't power hungry. Yeah, so that's Claudius for you. There's a great miniseries about him called I, Claudius, and a great series of books as well. Then we get into some of the bad ones, like Caligula. So Caligula has a reputation as the crazy emperor. Nowadays, historians think that's not true. It's more that he was just a real piece of work, a real jerk, who would mess with people and be incredibly cruel to them. He is maybe the first example of what we call a spoiled brat emperor, right? That this was someone who knew he was going to be emperor, became emperor really early on in life when he was basically a young teenager, and felt that he could have whatever he wanted and could do whatever he wanted. And so that's one sign that having emperors might be a bad idea, is that it produces people like this. Famously, Caligula made his horse a senator, which we think was a move to just troll the Senate and to say, hey, I'll laugh in your face, I'll make my horse a senator, I'll do whatever I want. We don't think that the horse actually voted on anything, so not a successful senator. But yeah, Caligula has a reputation as being one of the notorious bad ones. Another one of the bad ones is Nero. Now, this is actually up for debate. He's one where maybe he looks worse because people have painted him in a bad light. But you might have heard the story, the idea, or the phrase, Nero played the fiddle while Rome burned. Well, they didn't have fiddles back then. I think it was Shakespeare who came up with the idea of playing the fiddle. But some historians of the time who were biased against him did say that he played the lyre, kind of like a harp, while Rome was going through a terrible fire. He just partied and enjoyed himself. We think now that's probably not true, but what did happen is that Rome went through this terrible fire, and Nero took some of the land that had been burned down in the fire, and he decided to make himself a house. And he built himself a mansion and a park for himself and his friends. And so that might be part of why he had that bad reputation. He didn't, try to rebuild people's houses or anything like that. And if you do interpret him negatively, he would again be one of those brat emperors. And in fact, things got to be really bad under him because he basically there was a coup. He was overthrown, and the original family of Augustus Caesar was brought to an end as emperors by his assassination. We entered what was known as the Year of the Four Emperors. 4 different emperors in the same year, like, emperors that try to take the throne but only last like a couple of months. That's not good. That's not a good sign for people who like emperors, and it's not a good sign for the Roman Empire in general. And so there's a feeling that, like, can this whole idea of emperors or the Roman Empire even survive? How is this going to work? But it turned out it actually worked better than people expected. The 4th of the 4 emperors in that year was a guy named Vespasian. And Vespasian seems to have been a really capable general. He pulled the empire back together and established a new imperial family. And this was a big deal because for a certain interpretation, a lot of people could just interpret it as like, okay, well, emperors just means the family of Augustus Caesar. This is the family that runs Rome. That's the way it works. But if you're not part of that family, obviously you can't be emperor. But Vespasian made people think about that differently. He said, I'm the emperor, you've got to accept it. And he managed to convince people that it was a good idea to have him in charge. And so his family, the Flavians, continued on where Augustus's family left off. And I want to mention just a few more here. At this point, we get into lots of different families running the empire. So different families, ruling for a good, handful of decades each. And particular emperors are worth noting here. The one I want to mention especially is Trajan. So Trajan is kind of known for being the record setter for Rome's expansion. So this map here, which I've been showing you, this is Trajan's doing to get Rome to be quite this big. What he did is he conquered the pink areas here, which were the places of the Dacians. So another tribe or group of people that were not a settled city-dwelling civilization. Trajan basically established that, he took the borders out to them. And his was kind of the last expansion. That was the biggest Rome ever got. Because after him, they started realizing that they didn't want to keep getting bigger and bigger, because then if they did that, they were going to run into trouble. But Trajan gets a lot of respect for being a capable military commander who could do that sort of thing. And it seems like the Roman military during this time period was extremely effective. And that was in part thanks to emperors like Trajan, who were good at being generals. And in a second, I'm going to talk about Trajan's Column, which shows off, or maybe in the next video, I'll talk about Trajan's Column, which shows off his victory over the Dacians. But Trajan was succeeded by a guy named Hadrian. And Hadrian is one of the most interesting emperors. He had a lot going on for himself. The big thing in relation to Trajan, he was the successor to Trajan. He followed on from him. And he took a look at these borders of Rome and he said, this is as big as we want to get. And, the Roman emperors could have tried to keep conquering forever. But Hadrian said, let's actually stop it here. Let's consolidate and let's focus on, what's actually within our empire. Let's focus on making that part stronger rather than, overextending ourselves. And one of the big problems for the empire in later time periods was being overextended and not being able to keep things secure and in place. So as far as historians are concerned, Hadrian had some insight there. And Hadrian, this comes from Hadrian from a deep love of the different parts of his empire. He was a traveler. He liked to appreciate the different cultures that were within the empire. And he didn't like Rome itself that much. He didn't stay in Rome. He didn't like being around the senators. And in particular, he was a really, really big fan of Greek culture, to the point where his enemies called him Graeculus, which means something like little Greek baby boy, or something like that, the Greek boy. He got a reputation for being a lover of Greek culture. And in part that was because when he was younger, he had studied Greek philosophy and Greek culture and Greek science in Athens. He had gone to the schools of the philosophers before he was emperor. And when he became emperor, he added a lot of new buildings to Athens. He donated a lot to them. He finished this giant temple to Zeus that they'd been working on forever. He was really big into architecture. If you go to Athens today, you'll see like half of the buildings are from the ancient Greek period. Half of the buildings are from Hadrian adding new stuff because he really liked his old college town. And in terms of consolidation, he would do things like he is famous for building a wall in Britain, roughly where the border of Britain and Scotland is. He took a look at the people up there and said, yeah, we're not going to bother with those people. They're a little too wild, and it's not worth our time. Depends on what, it might depend whether you think he was scared of them or he was just being smart about that. I like to think he was being smart. But he was in general just a really big fan of Greek knowledge and architecture. He actually was an architect himself. He tried to design buildings. He designed things like the Temple of Trajan. Of course, you got to have a temple to your previous emperor. Temple of Venus and Roma. So the goddess Venus and the goddess of Rome, the sort of the spirit of Rome. That's something we're going to look at in a second. When they made a list of good emperors in around this time period, the writers basically put him and Trajan on that list of good emperors. Emperors that people actually liked and did a pretty good job. And he was into Egyptian culture, he was into Syrian culture. He has this whole sort of party house for himself where, in a place outside of Rome, where he had all this different kinds of architecture from different parts of the empire, Greek and Egyptian and Eastern. He was, in fact, so into Greek culture that he practiced the Greek style of romance, which was to have a younger boyfriend. And his younger boyfriend was a guy named Antinous. And Antinous died in a mysterious boating accident in Egypt. We don't know what happened. Some people think, did he jump off the boat? Was he trying to run away from Hadrian? It's kind of hard to say. Or was it just a complete accident? We don't know. But Hadrian seems to have been very grieved by Antinous's death. And so what he did is he made Antinous into a god, and he put statues of him all over the empire for people to worship him, worship his dead lover. And it's because of this that Antinous might be the best known face in terms of ancient statues. There's just so many statues of him. And of course, he had statues of him at his villa as well. So Hadrian definitely had a lot going on and was very much a fan of doing things the Greek way. He even brought back beards for the Romans. For a while there, the emperors didn't have beards because they were clean-shaven military men. And then here's Hadrian over here being a Greek hippie, basically. But he made it come back into style. A couple more I want to mention. Marcus Aurelius comes up a lot because he wrote a book of philosophy. He was a Stoic. He focused on Stoicism, which, has that philosophy of having this mentality that lets, suffering just wash right over you. You maintain this sort of inner peace, and then you aren't really affected by anything. You don't have any negative experiences because you have that inner peace. And so his book called Meditations is still very popular today in terms of Stoic philosophy. It's a pretty interesting read, actually. Marcus Aurelius, also one of the good emperors. Unfortunately, he may have been a good emperor, but he did not make his son a good person because his son was definitely one of the bad emperors. But here's this warrior soldier guy who also writes philosophy in his spare time. That's kind of interesting. I think he's the one who's being depicted in the movie Gladiator at the very start, even though that movie takes a lot of liberties with the characters of Marcus Aurelius and Commodus. But if you kind of want to see a depiction of him, I think that's kind of fun. And then I also want to mention Septimus Severus. One of the reasons he's cool is because he's the first emperor from Africa. He was, we were pretty sure, dark-skinned. So he was, African ethnically. And what this shows is that emperors stopped being, just like the dominant culture of Rome, which was never like 100% like white people anyway. But the sort of ethnic complexity, we might say diversity or richness of the empire did affect who the emperors were. And Septimus Severus was a well-liked emperor who kind of brought things back to normal after Marcus Aurelius's terrible son. So yeah, I think Septimus Severus is pretty cool. Okay, those are the emperors I wanted to mention. The ones I really want to emphasize are Augustus himself, Trajan, the big conqueror, Hadrian, the sort of consolidator and unifier, and Vespasian, who had a really hard job, which was to make sure the empire continued and the role of the emperors continued after a new family took power. So let's go back to thinking about him a little bit. How would you do this? How would you do this job of making people believe in emperors again? And not only that, make people believe in new emperors. Because remember, like Nero does seem to have been pretty unpopular by the end there, at least in the standard version of the story. And people were really mad at him for the things that he had done, like taking their land to make his own house, and seeming kind of apathetic about the fire, and maybe being kind of a spoiled brat. So you have this bad emperor, and then the whole thing kind of self-combusts for like a year. And then you have this emperor who wants to make things stable again, and more importantly, get people to actually believe that he's allowed to be emperor. What kind of things would you do? What do you think would be the strategy to make this happen? So if you're thinking about that, what might be the possibilities? Okay, you'd want to make people like you. You'd want to give them reasons to think you're cool, like Julius Caesar and to some extent Augustus did back in the day. And you'd want to really show to the people that that you were sorry for the way Nero had turned out. You'd want to kind of make things right there. And in general, you just want to focus on positivity, also strength, you're a good military leader, but not this kind of arrogance that the bad emperors had. So I think those were all the kinds of thoughts that were in Vespasian's mind when he started this new imperial family. And it's a big question in historical studies, like why didn't the Roman people rise up in rebellion against the emperors? And the answer is because the emperors did things to make them happy and keep them distracted. And this philosophy has been called bread and circuses. Basically, the emperors gave two things to the people. They gave them food, but they made sure they had enough to eat. And in fact, there was an official free food program for the Romans. You could get free bread from certain distribution centers throughout the city. And you could have spectacle. This is the word circuses here. So entertainment, spectacle, shows, things to keep them distracted and also happy. Circuses here means racetracks, basically. It's not quite like our modern word circus. So the racetracks that the Romans enjoyed. There were two really big sporting events in Rome. There were chariot races and gladiator matches. And gladiator matches were very popular, involving these, these fights with these sort of superstar gladiators. And then the chariot races had their own superstars, and it was kind of like NASCAR or something like that, in that you could often see people crash and die in these races. So these were very intense forms of entertainment, but they were very popular. The upper class Romans were kind of snooty about it. They sniffed at them and said, we can't allow any of that. That's bad. But the emperors knew that it was a way to make people happy. So if people have enough to eat and they have entertainment, then they're not going to rebel. And this is something that is kind of an inspiration behind the Hunger Games. Actually, the whole thing is named Pan Am. That's bread and circuses. Pan Am would be bread and. One of the main characters, Peta, is literally named after bread. And then the whole games are basically this way of providing an entertainment, violent entertainment that distracts the common people and causes them not to rise up in rebellion. So yeah, that's worth thinking about. And then in terms of spectacle, one of the things that Vespasian did was he built the Flavian Amphitheater. So remember, his family's the Flavians. This is a famous building in Rome that's also known as the Colosseum. And so this is a giant arena to watch your gladiator matches. And guess where he built it? He built it right where Nero had his house. He tore down that house and he made this for the common people to enjoy instead. So that's the kind of thinking he was doing. And I want to continue on in this vein and talk about the kind of monuments that the emperors made. On the philosophy that showing people things that are spectacular makes them like you, I want to show you guys something kind of cool and spectacular. And so in the next video, I'm going to show you guys something called Minecraft Rome.